Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about machine learning, which is a vibrant research field and a key contributor to the science of big data. So you may have heard about Go playing machine learning programs. This is a very complex board game, more complex than chess. And you heard Marvin Chow talk about Google's self-driving cars, also a machine learning application. When machine learning courses are offered at Stanford, routinely 700 or more students register for the course. So what's all the fuss and what's the relationship between this and big data? Well, big data gives us enormous haystacks of information to sort through. But what we'd really like to do is find the good stuff in the data, and all the processing power in the world alone will not be sufficient. That's where machine learning comes in. Machine learning concerns the study of computer programs that learn from data, and this is a core topic within artificial intelligence, or AI. It's of enormous interest in industry and at universities where the discipline of machine learning is housed primarily within computer science departments, but also across disciplinary boundaries. Right here at BC, we have active machine learning research. There are 3 core faculty involved in this area, 1 visitor, Miriam Saloom, also this year, and our students are doing very interesting work at the undergraduate level. So I'll show you 3 ways in which machine learning can be used for big data: prediction, categorization, and deep computational modeling. Machine learning programs learn to predict the correct answers to questions by looking at examples. And so in the same way that a child would learn by being given by a teacher examples with the answers, so it is with these machine learning programs. So it might be shown this image and asked the question, what is that an image of? The answer, of course, being cat, and it would be given the answer. And likewise, this is an image of a car. And so with such examples available to it, a set of inputs and outputs, the question is, how do you link those questions, the inputs x to the outputs y, by some function so that later, when a new question arises, the answer could then be predicted correctly. I'll show you one model of machine learning, neural networks. These are models based loosely on the pattern of interconnections of neurons in the visual cortex of higher mammals, and they collectively compute the predictions that they're making. In this case, we see a neural network that predicts whether a breast tumor is benign or malignant. That's at the right-hand side, having been fed input on the left-hand side involving measurements of the tumor. This learning occurs by a form of synaptic plasticity, which refers to the strengthening or weakening of connections between neurons. And the details, of course, involve some things that I can't get into, but an energy or cost function has to be minimized, and that's at the root of this process. So we can look at this example of images, right? How to figure out that that's a cat, and that this is also a cat, even though it's in a car. That's a cat in a car. So the network must learn that those are the correct answers and be able to generalize. So we can see this in action if I can get this cursor on there. How do I get the, okay. So this is an example by Andrej Karpathy at Stanford, and we see the neural network is actually running and the synaptic plasticity is occurring in real time here. I'll scroll past all of these details and show you at the bottom, if I can get there. I'm not a Mac person, so here we go. Make mistakes. We can see some of the images that the network is examining. And so there you see the images, and to the right of each image there are 3 words, probably too small for you to read, but they're the top guesses that the network currently has for what the correct label is of the image. The true label is in green, and in many cases you see still, because the learning is progressing, that green doesn't even appear among the top 3 guesses. And right now the network is only correctly predicting about 20% of the answers correctly, but with time, given a few hours, this network will exceed 85% or so of correct answers, which isn't bad for a toy example. The current state of the art of these networks is competitive with human performance, and in fact, in certain cases, exceeds it. Right here at BC, our students are doing very interesting work. My thesis student, Ning Lu, is predicting stock prices using machine learning. See the variation there. We'd like to know, will the stock price go up or down? And so he uses a network model, in this case a Bayesian network, different than a neural network. This one uses conditional probability. And he obtains predictions that are significantly better than random, and there can be enormous value in that. Let's go on to categorization. With my colleagues, we work on machine learning applied to health problems. And here we see a patient wired up with physiological sensors, things like blood flow, respiration, EEG, brainwave sensing, heart rate, and so on. And we get data like this, sampled about 200 times a second. Over the course of a night, it's about a gigabyte of data. With ambulatory monitoring over days and several patients, we're easily in the terabyte range, and so one very easily gets into big data. And the question is, how do you explore this quite large and complex haystack? But there's a difference to point out between this and the image labeling example, and that's that we no longer really know what answers we're looking for. You know, sleep medicine can say some things about what's in a polysomnographic recording, but not everything. And so the point of learning changes to picking from a pre-selected set of labels to really discovering what a good answer looks like anyway, what the categories are that we would like to predict. And that's called unsupervised learning. So we do sleep dynamics clustering. Sleep dynamics refers to the pattern of changes between, say, deep sleep and light sleep and REM sleep during the night. And we cluster patients, discovering groups of sleep patients that basically sleep in a similar manner within a given group, similar dynamics, but are very different in the way they sleep across different groups. Okay? We only use the sleep dynamic information. We don't use health history, we don't use demographic information, health questionnaires, and so forth. We make it intentionally difficult because we'd like to know how much we can get from the way that people sleep, that alone. And it turns out that even though that's all we use, the results reflect overall health quite well. Here's a visualization of some of the clustering results. And so you see the green, the various colors represent the groupings that have been found by the machine learning algorithm. And if one looks at these various clusters, for example, the one on the right, even though we only looked at the way people sleep and not anything about their health, the ones on the right in the green tend to be younger, non-smokers, and generally in overall better health. Whereas the ones in the lower left, are less healthy and in particular have a higher incidence of heart disease. And so the potential arises here, even though we haven't done a longitudinal study, but the potential is there for one perhaps to do ambulatory monitoring with inexpensive mobile devices. And if a person, self-reports, say, a migration of his or her record from the upper right to the bottom left, it might be time to call the doctor. It might be an early warning that something is going wrong with their health. And so this type of inexpensive, non-invasive monitoring of health through sleep alone, I think, could be very powerful. People are also running around with these, Fitbits and various other fitness wristband devices, and so that's an enormous market that's expected to triple over the next 4 years. And the same kinds of techniques can be used to extract value, in particular health-related information from that sort of data. So let's go on to deep computational modeling. The term deep learning is very popular, as evidenced by Google searches for this term since 2013. You may have heard about AlphaGo, which is a deep learning, machine learning program done by Google DeepMind that has just won 4 of 5 games against one of the top-ranked Go players in the world. And again, this is a very complex game, more complex than chess. It was thought that this would be beyond the reach of artificial intelligence, perhaps until the middle of the 21st century, and it just happened. So what is deep learning, anyway? So in essence, it's a technique of machine learning for extracting representations of data at multiple levels of abstraction. We see here an example where the deep learning architecture is on the right. Each one of those gray boxes is a neural network in its own right. A typical model like this might have between 10 and 20 of those floors. And so information, like the image on the left, is fed into the bottom, and then through a simple learning algorithm, the details of which aren't really programmed in, what happens as a result of learning is that each one of these layers turns out to specialize in certain aspects of the input, right? Again, that behavior is not programmed in, it emerges. And the layers that are nearest to the input end up specializing in simple, in this case, simple geometric lines, shadows, corners, and so forth. But as one goes up the hierarchy, one finds that the focus of these networks, automatically again, is on more macroscopic and abstract concepts. Things like parts of the body or entire faces, and higher up still, no room in the slide for this, concepts like man versus woman or dog versus cat. And this emerges naturally from machine learning. The result of this is a computational model, the network, and that can explain the processes that gave rise to the data in the first place. And that's what I want to mention. We can generate new examples of data in this way, and think of this maybe as a sort of model that one might use in the natural sciences, for example. So how does one do that? Well, in essence, rather than flowing from bottom to top in that stack, the information will now flow from the top to the bottom. Once we've learned a representation in one of these deep networks, and for example, here the network has learned that there are discovered certain categories in the data that it was looking at, we then ask it to run the equations backwards to figure out, or to imagine, if you will, what sort of inputs might have led to these representations. And so it imagines these examples down at the bottom. Now these examples are, in this case, numerical digits, right? But they're not identical to anything the network has seen. In a sense, they're really imagined by the network. At BC, we have undergraduate computer science students doing work with the latest deep learning research results. My thesis student, Ayako Mikami, who was presenting just now, hopefully you got to see her demo, is working on automated composition of music using a certain type of neural network. So here on the right, we see a musical score produced automatically by the machine learning technique. And let's try to listen. Okay, so we're not going to listen to it. Small glitch there. Anyway, hopefully you can check out her demo, which is around somewhere. But what you listen to, the network can generate little musical pieces that, again, are not identical to the sorts of music it's been listening to, but preserves elements of that. But there's an element of creativity in it too. So I think it's remarkable that this can be done. And also, students Jesse Mu and Andrew Frankel, also presenting here, they were students in my artificial intelligence course last fall, and for their term project, they worked with some very recent result in deep learning, and they were able to extract artistic style from images and transfer that style to other images. So for example, here we see Van Gogh's Starry Night, which is our artistic style model, and we present another, they presented another photograph, in this case a photo of Gasson Hall right here on the Boston College campus. And the machine learning extracts the style of the Van Gogh and superimposes it on the image of Gasson Hall. We see the result right here, where the final result is in the bottom right. And so you see it's basically a Van Gogh style rendering of Gasson Hall. And what's remarkable about this is not just that it's possible with the Van Gogh, because there are some rather inexpensive apps that do similar things, not at this level of quality though, but the fact that you can change the style image and the network will automatically respond. It's completely general. So just in closing, I hope I've shown you that machine learning is a powerful source of computational models. We talked about prediction, categorization, and generation, though there are more possibilities. And this is computer science, but it has a very strong cross-discipline impact, right? In particular, because the machine learning programs can be viewed as computational models. And again, this can be used in the natural sciences and elsewhere, just like mathematics has always been used as models of phenomena. So some examples here. At the highest level journals, this is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we see neuroscientists starting to use these computational machine learning models to explain natural phenomena, right? And so in this case, it's shown that a deep learning network can predict behavior that is actually seen in actual neural tissue, in actual visual cortex. Prediction of forest fire hazards and various other things like this can be improved with machine learning. Here we see quantum chemists predicting molecular properties based on structure. Visualization in economics and other fields where one can categorize documents based on content much more accurately than ever before with machine learning. In art, there are many possibilities. We mentioned, the transfer of style example, but also just noticing influences of one artist on another, or detecting forgeries and things like this. And my own work, we're involved in health-related research using machine learning, which can predict quality of life after surgical procedures, prognosis, and so forth. And many more things, finance, personalized marketing, and so forth that I don't have time to get into. So I think the time is ripe for us to really come together, I think, as a community at Boston College and pursue an interdisciplinary effort in data science, and I hope we'll take advantage of this opportunity. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This has really been a fascinating day, and I am thrilled to be here and to be a part of it. What I want to talk with you about today is how advances in neuroimaging methods are allowing us to learn much more about how the human brain works and how it gives rise to our ability to experience and modify our emotions, to remember events from our past, and how all of this is being made possible both by advances in the data that we're able to collect and also by the sorts of advances that you've been hearing about all morning in terms of the ways that we're able to analyze those data. When we think about big data within the context of psychology, one of the things that might come to mind is following people over long periods of time or following large groups of individuals. And certainly this is something that we do. Just to give one example from my laboratory, we have a number of studies that are ongoing where we ask participants to wear watches that monitor their activity levels during the day and that help us to assess the quality of their sleep overnight. We can look at how their activity and how their sleep quality relate to their emotional experience, their reported stress levels, and also to their memories for different events that occurred during those periods of time. But again, today what I want to focus on is something slightly different, which is the fact that we can also be collecting big data from much smaller windows of time by looking in the brain when we collect MR data from individuals. And today I'm going to be giving examples of this type of neuroimaging data that we've collected to try to address questions like, how are memories stored within networks of brain regions? How do regions of the brain communicate with one another in order for us to be able to modify our emotional reactions? And I want to emphasize that both of these types of questions are not about the function of single brain regions. They're about the function of groups of brain regions that together are interacting and are modifying the way that different regions are functioning. These are questions that until very recently were impossible to answer because we didn't have at our fingertips the type of analytic methods that were going to be necessary to track these changes in brain activity over time and therefore to look at how interactions between brain regions were changing. When we collect neuroimaging data, we're primarily collecting three types of scans. Structural scans that give us information about the boundaries of the gray matter, where the cell bodies are located, and the white matter of the brain that connects the cell bodies to one another. Diffusion-weighted imaging scans that provide us finer-grained information about those white matter pathways that connect different regions of the brain. They help us to tell us whether or not essentially there are very intact highways linking one region to another, or whether or not they may be degraded highways that might have some potholes. We collect functional scans that give us a metric of neural activity by providing us information on blood oxygen levels throughout the brain. And blood oxygen levels are correlated with neural activity, which is how that gives us some indirect measure of the neural activity as people are performing tasks or are lying in the scanner with their minds wandering as they may naturalistically do. I want to begin by talking about some examples of what we've been able to learn from functional scans, because that's really the type of imaging technology that has undergone the largest advances over the last decade. So if I were here a decade ago giving this talk rather than today, what I would have been able to tell you about was a story about brain activity that was unfolding over about a 30-second window. We would be taking snapshots of that brain activity about once every 3 seconds, but we would be averaging over all of those different time points. So I would be able to tell you something about how the brain worked in this 30-second period and how that compared to how it worked in another 30-second period, but I wouldn't be able to tell you much more information about the timing of brain activity. Within each of those 20 to 30 second time windows, I would be telling you about cubes of the brain that were 8 millimeters on each side. So we would have kind of a Lego-looking brain like that. So certainly, reasonable spatial resolution, but clearly not giving us very fine-grained information about where in the brain things were occurring or when over the time course of processing something was happening. But fortunately, since I'm not giving this talk a decade ago and I'm giving it to you today, what I'm able to tell you about are taken from snapshots of the brain that we're now able to acquire more frequently than once every second. So there's been a 4-fold increase in the temporal resolution of imaging technology. And in every one of these snapshots, we're now able to acquire images from cubes of the brain that are only 2 millimeters in spatial resolution. And we're now even starting to get closer to 1 millimeter. So there's been a 64-fold increase in the spatial resolution of this type of technology that's occurred over approximately the last decade. And you can just see when you look at it that this image of the brain there in the lower left is now starting to approximate what the actual human brain looks like. It no longer has that appearance of an assembly of Lego blocks. We're really starting to get at the resolution that matters in terms of understanding functions of large networks of neurons. So what this technology has allowed us to do is to ask more precise questions about how activity in different regions is ebbing and flowing over this type of time course, and how that's leading to different abilities, like our ability to experience or modify an emotion, like our ability to remember an event from the past. One of the types of questions that we've been really interested in trying to understand is what happens differently in the brain at the moment when someone is presented with some memory cue that reminds them of a past event, and the person is able to actually bring that event back to mind with a tremendous amount of vividness, remembering the details of the event, where someone was, when something happened, who else was with the person, but also bringing back to mind the internal thoughts and feelings that the person had at the time that that event took place. What happens differently in the brain when that is what happens as compared to another moment in time where someone gets a cue to a memory and maybe remembers that something happened, but isn't able to bring that event back to mind with any type of detail? The details are fuzzy. There's no memory for what we were thinking or what we were feeling when that event occurred. We're able to now use this temporal and spatial resolution that we have to look at how the interactions across different brain regions are different over short time windows when memories will later be very vivid versus when memories will be less vivid. We're also able to use machine learning algorithms, like you just heard talked about, to actually tell us about which regions of the brain actually hold the most predictive power for telling us whether or not at the moment that that memory cue is presented, a particular memory is going to come to mind with a lot of detail and vividness, or whether it's going to be one of these fuzzier memories that lacks vividness. So just to make this concrete and to tell you about one recent study that we completed, we asked participants to study a series of photographs, each paired with a verbal label. And then after a delay, we showed them the verbal label, and we asked them, is this a label that you saw presented previously? If it is, I want you to spend a couple of seconds, try to bring back to mind the photograph that you saw associated with that label, try to remember anything that you might have thought or felt as you saw that image, and then rate the vividness. Rate the vividness both for the thoughts and feelings that you were able to bring back to mind, and also rate the vividness with which you were able to remember the photograph that had been presented. What we were critically interested in was how brain activity and interactivity at that initial moment when the retrieval cue was presented, before participants had been asked to bring a lot of detail back to mind, how brain interactivity at that moment in time would relate to the later vividness of their memories. And we were particularly interested in how this relation to vividness might be connected with interactivity with this region of the brain shown here in blue, a region of the brain called the hippocampus. Now, it's long been known that the hippocampus is critically important for memory. If you have damage to the hippocampus, you become amnesic. You're no longer able to form new long-term memories. The hippocampus is one of the first regions that's affected in Alzheimer's disease. There was recently even a Nobel Prize awarded for links between the hippocampus and place cells, our ability to know where within an environment something has taken place. So we know that this region is important for memory, but where there has been a lot of debate is whether or not the hippocampus is just important for remembering where something occurred or when something occurred, these external event details that anchor something in time and place, or whether or not it's also important for helping us to remember our internal state when something occurred. What were we thinking about? What were we feeling? And so that was the question that we wanted to go after here. And in brief, what we found was that indeed at that moment that someone got a retrieval cue, the strength of the connections between the hippocampus and these regions shown here in red, and I'll point out just that they're all toward the front of the brain, that those links were stronger in instances where someone said that they were very vividly able to bring back to mind the thoughts and the feelings that they had experienced during the initial presentation of that information. So again, at the moment that a cue from the past was presented, this connectivity with the hippocampus was predicting that later ability to remember the thoughts and feelings associated with that event. And importantly, that connectivity did not predict the vividness for just the details of the photograph. And in some cases, there actually was an inverse correlation with that vividness. So this isn't just a generic increase in the veracity of a memory or the detail of a memory. It's really specific to being able to bring back to mind our own internal state from a past moment in time. So this just provides one example of how computational advances that have happened over the last decade, our ability to look at smaller and smaller portions of the brain, so we even have the spatial resolution to look at a region like the hippocampus that's quite tiny. Our ability to measure brain activity more frequently so that we're able to actually distinguish that cue period, that moment that someone saw the word shadow, from the later moments in time when someone is rating the vividness. So remember, a decade ago, that all would have been within the same 30-second epoch, and we wouldn't have been able to distinguish anything within that time range. And critically, to our ability to track that ebb and flow of activity over that time window, to be able to look at interactions between different brain regions, so that this is not just a story about the involvement of the hippocampus, but about its interconnections with other regions of the brain. These are all the sorts of computational advances that have led us to have these fundamentally new insights into how human memory works. Understanding that it's at the moment that we see a cue that already the way that our brain is going to become wired up is going to relate to the likelihood that we're going to be able to bring back past events, past thoughts and feelings connected to that cue. And again, also emphasizing that the hippocampus is not just a region that helps us to remember the where and the when of an event, but also a region that helps us to remember how we felt during that event and what we thought during that event. That's one example from using these types of functional scans that tell us about how regions of the brain are working as we're performing a task. But as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, a lot of what we do is also acquire structural information about the brain. What is the nature of the gray matter of the brain, of the white matter that connects the different regions of the brain? And here we've been very interested in trying to use age-related changes in brain structure to help us to solve an emotion processing mystery that occurs with age. This is the mystery. When younger adults regulate their emotions, when they try to change how they feel, they use their frontal lobes. So these regions shown in red here are the regions that younger adults tend to use when they're trying to modify how they feel in the moment. Older adults have substantial atrophy to those frontal lobe regions of the brain. So if we look across the whole brain, we see that there's extensive cortical thinning with age. So this is plotting age here on the x-axis and the thickness of the cortex on the y-axis, and so you can see this linear decline in the cortical thickness with aging. But when we divide the brain up into its lobes, you can see that it's actually the frontal regions of the brain, here in red, the frontal lobe regions, that show the strongest links between age and cortical thinning. So younger adults are using these frontal regions to regulate their emotions. Older adults show significant atrophy to those same frontal regions. And yet, most older adults are at least as good as younger adults at regulating their emotions, and in fact, often they're better. How is this possible? Well, one clue to this mystery has come from some of our research that's been looking at the links between structural integrity of the regions that connect different brain regions and their functional connectivity when people are actually asked to modify how they're feeling in the moment. We've been particularly interested in the structural integrity of this pathway here because it connects the prefrontal regions with regions embedded in the brain that are important for emotion processing. What we've found is that specifically in older adults, not in middle-aged or younger adults, there's a strong relation whereby structural connectivity seems to actually relate to the functional connectivity as participants are being asked to change how they feel. In other words, specifically in older adults, Only if this connection is strong do older adults also show a strong link between these frontal regions important for regulation and other regions that are involved in emotional experience, like the amygdala. Whereas in middle-aged and younger adults, it's not so specifically tied to that structural integrity, presumably because younger and middle-aged adults don't yet have as much variability and potential atrophy in those pathways. So these results suggest that, for one, some older adults probably are using those frontal regions. They have the structural pathways that allow those regions to connect to emotion processing regions. And so in that subset of older adults, they're regulating their emotions as well as younger adults because they have the structural pathways that allow them to do so. But what about in larger groups of older adults where presumably they don't all have those structural pathways? Well, here we've been looking at cortical thickness, or the amount of gray matter on the cortex, and we've been looking at how that relates to participants' self-reported ability to change how they feel in the moment when they need to. In younger adults, not surprisingly, we find that it's the cortical thickness of the prefrontal cortex that shows this relation to their ability to regulate their emotions. But in older adults, it's not the prefrontal cortex, it's different regions. Here, this is within the temporal lobe that are instead showing that relation. And what this suggests to us then is that on the whole, as a group, young and older adults are probably relying on different strategies to help them to change how they feel in the moment. Again, younger adults, as we've known from a large literature, are relying on these frontal lobe strategies, but older adults are doing something different. And we think that what they're likely doing is they're actually drawing on the database of experiences and knowledge that they've acquired over their lifetime to help them reframe a situation, to help them think about it in a different way, maybe even to remember how they were able to deal with something in the past, and they're using that information to modify how they feel in the present moment. And that's very different than what younger adults are doing, which seems to be a much more fluid and active process, requiring them to draw on these prefrontal processes. So these are just two examples, but I hope that they've really demonstrated both how the human brain is able to generate big data, but also how we're able to use a lot of the analytics that had been associated with this big data revolution in order to provide new insights into the functioning of the human brain. Again, particularly how advances in temporal and spatial resolution of imaging technology and computational analysis advances have allowed us to measure these sorts of higher order network correlations, and how this has improved our understanding of human memory, where we now have a better understanding of how what we remember about an event is a product of brain connectivity patterns the moment that a retrieval cue is presented. It's that early in the retrieval process. And that when it comes to emotion regulation, part of the answer to this emotion processing mystery with age is that with age, structural integrity seems to be playing an even greater role in dictating functional connectivity. If you still have structural pathways as an older adult, you may be using those pathways in a similar way to a younger adult. But if you don't, that may be when compensatory strategies start to come into play, and the older adult brain may actually start to accomplish the same tasks as younger adults are doing, but through a different route, through a different means. I'd like to end by thanking all of the brains behind the data that I presented today in terms of the members of my laboratory, especially Drew, Chris, Sarah, and Jackie, whose data I had the opportunity to talk with you about this afternoon. And I also want to thank all of our collaborators, as well as the many undergraduate students that have been critically involved in this research. Thank you.
Well, I'm very excited to be here today talking about bringing economic models to big data. And I want to just start by talking about what we often think of as a common use of big data, which is prediction. And we've already heard Sergio talking about prediction and forecasting. And indeed, forecasting is important to the operations of many institutions and businesses. We use this for admitting students, greenlighting television shows, ordering inventory for our catalogs. And detailed data, sort of big data, are important inputs to those processes, and it's hard to get them right. A lot of resources going to getting that, and we work hard to develop tools to improve those forecasts. Indeed, forecasts tend to work quite well in a lot of, in an environment that's relatively stable. Okay? And I use that as a springboard because, of course, the mission of an academic economic researcher is very different. The mission of an economic researcher is to tackle social problems. And what happens when we sort of change social policy almost always is a change in the environment. And so when we have a change in the environment now, it's not enough just to have a prediction or a forecast. What we need is to understand the causal relationships between a particular event and people's responses to it, typically. Okay? So we're going to need more guidance when we're thinking about changing social policies. Okay? So how do economic researchers do this? Well, I sort of set it out as a three-step process. The first step is we need to organize the data. The second step is to find the correlations, sort of the things that move in the data that are going to tell us about the effects that we're interested in. And the third step is where sort of the magic happens, and that is sort of bringing economic models of behavior to the data. Okay? And I'll say just a little bit about each one of those steps. So step one, organizing the data. Sometimes big data can be too big, and we can get lost. And so it's important to think hard about what kind of data structure we need to create when we're starting these studies. So we need to choose our groups or time periods carefully. We need to understand when to aggregate and when not to aggregate. And we need to use knowledge of industries and markets to give us guidance on how to organize the structure of that data. As economists, we lean heavily on the insights from our colleagues in statistics and computer science. We often take advantage of statistical properties of the data, particularly to help us aggregate. And we use machine learning techniques, and we're constantly trying to incorporate those techniques to help us in our studies. Step two, finding the things that move. So of course, correlations in the data is what helps us to understand the effects that we're interested in. We might use variation over time, over markets, firms, or individuals. And variation, of course, can come from a number of sources. So they might come from optimizing decisions that agents are making. So how does a firm set prices? How do they make entry decisions or purchasing decisions for consumers? But they may also be generated by experimental variation, either through field experiments in which a researcher or a firm removes a product, changes a price, moves something on their website, and indeed firms are doing more and more of this these days. Or from natural experiments. This might be something that happened in the environment that was not anticipated by agents. So it could be an extreme weather event, an unanticipated breakdown in the supply chain, or anything like that. And step three, bringing models to the data. So once we have steps 1 and 2, so we've got a well-organized data structure, and we've identified the correlations that are going to be important for understanding the effects that we're interested in. When we have those in place, that's when we're ready to try to do predictions, okay? And we're going to, optimize our tools and bring in as much data as we can to do that. And that's primarily what we're going to be doing in a stable environment, okay? When we're switching to analyzing, as I said, social policy questions, something that changes the environment, now we need causal models of how agents behave. And that's where the economics behind the research become really important. So we might ask, how do consumers choose products? How is it that firms optimize? What are they maximizing? How are they doing that? How do they compete with each other? Essentially, what does the demand look like in the market? What does the supply look like? And what kind of equilibrium do we have happening in the market? Now, the parameters of those economic models are going to need to be informed by the data, and they're going to be estimated from the data, and that's how we take advantage to sort of harness the potential of that resource. Okay? So what I'd like to do in the rest of my time here is walk you through 2 examples from my research lab here at BC. The first example gives a relatively simple laboratory for studying an important question in which the data inputs are, as I said, relatively on the simple side. And then I want to tell you about some new work in which we're using much more complex data structure, and to tell you a little bit about how we're tackling questions with that more complex structure. Okay? So the first example it asks the question of whether manufacturer rebates should be something that we allow in our economy or not. So, and this is work with Chris Conlon, who is a former student of mine who's now at Columbia University. A manufacturer rebate, you may have heard about these in the newspaper. They're sometimes referred to as kickbacks. We read a lot about them in the pharmaceutical industry. Intel was recently settled a very large antitrust case over their use of manufacturer rebates. And what a manufacturer rebate does is it's a manufacturer who says to a retailer, if you sell enough of my good, I'll write you a check at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, at some point. Okay? And so economic theory on these rebates kind of is two-sided. On one hand, economists, we recognize that these rebates might be good because they might encourage retailers or distributors or other downstream agents to promote goods, to put more effort in to the products, to make it easier for consumers to use the products, explain the products to them. And so we want those rebates to induce that kind of good behavior. On the other hand, they might be bad because perhaps a retailer responds to the incentives of the rebate by dropping the brands of a competing manufacturer. And that will limit consumer choice, and limit competition, and have a bad outcome for consumers and sort of for social welfare. Okay? Now, before big data, the way that we typically approached these kinds of, our ability to analyze these contracts was primarily limited to court records. We would look at a court case and we would say, well, the court ruled that this contract was anti-competitive, but this other one was pro-competitive, so when I look at this new contract, I might think it's anti-competitive. And of course, the downside to that type of approach is that the contracts that wind up in court are typically not your usual contract from the population of contracts in the economy. Okay? So what Chris and I do in our work is we take advantage of a large set of vending machines. It turns out that manufacturer rebates are used in the candy industry. And so we use vending machines that are computer monitored. They're either wirelessly monitored, sending back information every few hours, or they're monitored by handheld computers when drivers visit them. And the first thing we have to do, so step one, is to organize the data. And here we're primarily leaning on statistical insights, which tell us that we don't actually, unless my choice of a Snickers bar has a big impact on what you're hungry for, I can summarize, I can aggregate over individual purchases. So rather than tracking millions of transactions of individual candy bars, I can just look at choice sets. I can look at what the probabilities of purchase were under different environments where we had different products available. So that makes it much easier to organize the data. Step two, trying to find the relevant correlations. Well, it turns out that in vending machines, there's not often a lot of variation that's interesting. If you think about the last time you went into a vending machine, a lot of the prices are the same. The products don't rotate a lot, particularly when you're standing in front of it. And so what we want to do is create variation ourselves. So we engage in a field experiment in which we took we took a series of rebating products and we just exogenously, randomly removed them from machines. And then we could see how consumers respond to that, what happens to demand when we do that. And we can also see the profit hit that the downstream sort of vending operator takes and the manufacturer as well. Okay? So it sort of simulates what would happen if, in fact, the retailer slacked off and stopped reservicing the machine so frequently. Okay? Now, step three, I'm not going to go through the details of the model, but I'll tell you what the sort of the key modeling insights are that we use from the economics literature to help us, sort of to give us the right lens through which to view this well-organized data with nice variation, okay? And that is two pieces. On the demand side, we assume consumers are choosing their favorite candy. On the supply side, we have a model in which the retailer responds optimally to the incentives laid out for him when he chooses his restocking frequency. So how often he goes to service those machines is going to depend on the payoff structure that he faces. Okay? Through the use of that model, we're able to then quantify what the effects of these rebates are. And interestingly, we have found not that they're good or that they're bad, but they have both components at play. So we find that retailers provide better service, but they also drop some of the competing firms that consumers care about. On balance, however, we find that consumers, retailers, and the rebating brands are all better off, while the competing brands are worse off. So the model also gives us an ability to say something about the incidence of say, permitting different contracting choices in the economy. Okay? So now the second project I want to talk about is joint with two graduate students here, Nick Diebel and Sylvia Ristikeva, and we are examining the social impacts of advertising. So again, advertising, which accounts for more than 2% of GDP in the US, has sort of two sides of theory in it from economics. On one hand, if ads inform buyers of different products, that can be good. So will make it easier for consumers to find products that are better suited for them, and it will increase competition between products when there's an opportunity for new entrants to get in. On the other hand, they can be bad if they allow existing firms to sort of lock in buyers. Okay, that can limit and stifle competition in the market. And related to this, and I'm going to come back to this other paper, which is by two former students of mine now at the University of Pennsylvania, Mike Sinkinson and Amanda Stark, who look at the same question for the market of prescription drug ads. And the reason I'm going to come back to Mike and Amanda's work is that our work is sort of on a brand new data set, and I'm only going to show you step 3 for Mike and Amanda's work. Okay? So what Mike and Amanda do is and the U.S. is actually quite special in the pharmaceutical sector in that we allow direct-to-consumer advertising. So the U.S. and Japan are the only countries in the world that allow that. What do we think about that? Well, again, it could be good if it informs consumers of new treatments and leads to better health outcomes. On the other hand, it can be bad if it raises costs and reduces competition and makes it harder for new drugs to enter into the market. Okay? Again, before we had access to big data and the kinds of machine learning resources that we have now, we had a lot of theories about how this might work, but very little evidence on what actually happened in the economy. Okay? So step 1 for advertising, organizing the data. So I'll tell you a little bit about the data that Sylvia and Nick and I are working on. So this includes television viewership and programming data, and it covers 23 million set-top boxes over 3 years, and it's what the industry calls tune-level data. So every time anyone clicks a remote for any of these set-top boxes, we see that. Okay? So terabytes of data, second-by-second data on all the programming right down to the ad copy at any given second in time. Okay? So we start to organize this by defining markets for viewers. And we use machine learning, sort of, as Sergio described, unsupervised machine learning to cluster programs, okay? And this is because we use this because this is a method that scales to millions of shows and households, and very similar to some of the pictures that Sergio was showing you. I'm going to show you 2 examples, and I've put some labels on them, but of course the algorithm doesn't do this. So here are some reality shows, 2 different clusters, and you can see the cluster denoted by the circles includes what I'm going to call the male-oriented reality shows, Swamp People and Mounted in Alaska. There's another cluster up here, which I call female-oriented reality shows, Real Housewives of New Jersey and Real Housewives of Orange County. Okay, so the machine algorithm is clustering, the machine learning algorithm is clustering shows into these markets. Here's another one with children's shows, sort of Looney Tunes and Shrek with the diamond notation, and over in the circles, sort of teenage-oriented shows, 16 and Pregnant and America's Best Dance Crew as some examples. Okay? Now, on the other side of the market, of course, advertisers are choosing which markets to target their ads in, and we see this sort of as a nice sanity check, and this is also a form of variation, kind of step 2. In the advertising market. So these male-oriented reality shows, we see a lot of advertisements for cars, home improvement, travel, pharmaceuticals. The female-oriented ones, cosmetics, cars, movies, and wireless are the top advertisers there. And of course, children's, you can imagine, toys, movies, and cereal, okay? So it's sort of passing the sanity check. The machine learning algorithm is helping us to cluster things into markets that we think pass the smell test, so to speak, in the market. Okay. Step 2 for advertising. Now, here's where I'd like to give you some nice examples from the Sinkinson and Stark paper, and particularly in the environment that we are in right now this week. And I hope, I don't know if everyone was up as late last night as I was watching the results come in, but it turns out that political ads in the United States, political candidates may displace private ads during election season and pay the same price, okay? And so what happens when we're in a primary season like we are right now is primaries sort of turn off ads for prescription drugs, and it does so in different cities at different times. Okay? So what Mike and Amanda do is they combine ad data with data on statin prescriptions, and here's where I think it's really nice to see sort of the things that move, the correlations in the data that help us to learn from the data. So this was from the 2008 primary season. So you see already in November, Iowa and New Hampshire gearing up, and then you see running through all those different primary states, April, May, June, the end of the primaries, the conventions, and we go into general election season. So this is what we're facing collectively, okay? So So now what do Mike and Amanda do with this lovely changes in advertising intensity across these different markets? Well, their key modeling insight is that competing statin manufacturers are competing through their ads, okay? So they compete through ads. What happens is that what they find is that the ads do attract new patients, brings new patients into the market for statins, but many of them actually choose non-advertised brands of statins. The patients and the non-advertising brands benefit a lot from the advertising efforts of the branded drugs. If the branded drugs could find a way to unilaterally disarm from their advertising efforts, they would actually be better off. And so when the primaries turn that off, we have an opportunity to see that happen. Okay? Next up on our agenda is looking at limits on advertising that are sort of recently in the public vernacular. Sort of banning alcohol ads during college sports broadcasts is one recent policy change, and restricting the minutes of advertising that can be done in children's programming is a long-standing issue. Okay? So in conclusion, I just want to point out the wonderful opportunities that researchers can take advantage of these days with access to better data, more detailed, granular data, which opens new lines of research. It allows us to explore markets we've never been able to analyze before and to answer new questions. Importantly, it also allows us to gain insights from a broad sample, from sometimes the whole population of agents, not just from litigated outcomes or from selected groups. Okay? And I think these insights are going to be really crucial to how we understand and how we operate in today's economy. I'm going to end just with a list of the team from my own research lab here, graduate students and undergraduates alike who are all engaged, writing undergraduate theses and publishing other papers with this jointly with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for the presenters? Yes.
So each of you mentioned kind of increasing granularity and increasing ability of getting detailed data. So what's the current limit that you're facing? I don't know how much faster the brain works than the 750 milliseconds as an example, or candy bars people eat per minute. I'm not sure. So what's the thing that's currently limiting each of these types of analyses, or pixels in pictures? Where are the limits coming from now?
I'll jump in. So for the deep learning stuff in particular, the current limit really in terms of practicality depends on the application, but we really can't do real-time things because of hardware limitations. So the processing time. So for example, I mentioned that AlphaGo program in particular.
Is your mic on?
And so the thing is that with, how do I turn this on?
Okay.
Closer? Okay. So the AlphaGo game playing program in particular, for example, it works very well in some of these other applications when they're deployed, but the actual learning procedure on hundreds of parallel graphics processing units, which are extremely powerful processors, takes on the order of weeks. So, needless to say, that's going to change, and with not only advances in hardware, but also advances in algorithms, which is one of the fundamental things that computer science people do, I think that we'll see a definite speed up. It'll be very noticeable over the next few years.
I would say that we have limitations both in terms of the way that the data is being acquired. So, the 1 or 2 millimeter cubes that I was talking about, we're still talking about collections of hundreds of thousands of neurons. So you could certainly imagine wanting to continue to scale that up. Temporal resolution, we have complementary methods like electroencephalography where we have millisecond precision with timing, and that turns out to be extraordinarily useful, especially for linguistic processing where 750 milliseconds is way too slow to understand some aspects of it. So I think that there is still a long way to go in terms of the technology and the data that we're able to acquire. And at that point, we will then start to be up against many of these same issues in terms of how do you handle those data computationally.
I would add that we would face all those same issues in economics, both the ability to organize it in an efficient, quick way through algorithms, some of the hardware constraints, the computational requirements of estimating the economic models that I talked about. But the other more recent limitation, I think, or challenge in economic research for this is actually that on one hand, the access to these types of resources, the existence of them has become, has exploded. I mean, all of this stuff exists that didn't used to exist before. On the other hand, they tend to now be more well organized and held more centrally by, in many cases, larger firms or other repositories. And so finding ways of opening that access safely to a diversity of researchers can be very challenging. 15 years ago, with enough shoe leather, you could kind of run around and do something. And now you need the permission, you need some relationship with, with a data company in many cases to be able to access that. And that, of course, is for legitimate security reasons, but that just in practical terms is a major challenge, I think, in economic research.
Other questions for the presenters? Yes.
So this is a question for everybody, but especially Sergio, since you ended your presentation with a call to arms for more interdisciplinary data science at Boston College, and I was curious what you thought that would look like.
Oh, well, so yes, a number of us have been talking, so whatever I say is just, no? So a number of us have been talking, but, I'll say just what my personal opinion is. I'd like to see kind of a grassroots movement around some sort of institutional organism. I don't know whether it would look like a center or an institute or what it would be, but, I imagine people like you, Josh, quite frankly, participating there with computer scientists, with people from economics, with psychology, all of these disciplines, the humanities also. I think just the world has changed, and somehow it's taking us a while to catch up. BC, Boston College, is an outstanding liberal arts institution, but I think what that means is changing before our eyes, and we have to recognize that fact and try to formalize it somewhat, not only at the level of research, which I think an institute or center might provide, but also in terms of educational programs that students can contribute to.
Yes, sir, in the back.
You mentioned that one of the things you learned was that the statin ads kind of backfire because the brands pay for them. People learn about statins and then they buy generics, which aren't helping these people. Would it be illegal for those companies to get together and say, we're killing ourselves, guys. Let's stop advertising. And I note that in the old days when there were a lot more cigarette ads, and the evidence was that the cigarette ads didn't increase total smoking, they were just fighting over shares, the feds came in and banned a whole bunch of types of advertising, which was the best thing that ever happened to the cigarette companies. It might have been illegal for them to do that themselves. So what's the scoop on this?
I think that's exactly right. I don't know the details of any sort of legal limits to what the federal government could do for direct-to-consumer prescription drug advertising. Although it's interesting, an interesting contrast, Joe, is that the U.S. and Japan are the only countries that currently permit it to happen. And you're exactly right about this. The cigarette story is a very apt example here, because what happened in the master settlement, as Joe has pointed out, is that the federal government eliminated the ability of cigarette manufacturers to advertise, and the cigarette manufacturers were thrilled about this. They signed on very quickly. And so, there is sort of a prisoner's dilemma style problem, as we would say in economics, of how do you disarm? I just don't think they have the ability to do it. And your question is a little bit how might the federal government try to apply the Sherman Antitrust Act to prevent them from doing that? The federal government probably likes them doing all this advertising. So I don't know that we have a mechanism for them doing that. Yeah. But the cigarette thing is exactly appropriate to this case.
I think we have time for one more question before our break.
So I'd like to suggest to you a new opportunity that's coming around. We have very little in the way of machine-to-machine communications these days, but with SIM cards being implanted in machines like vending machines right now, M2M communications is under 5% of all vending machines, but will we can predict be over 50% only in a few years' time. My suggestion would be that this is the time to set up for grabbing that data for initial and very first look kinds of research. And I'm wondering what you think about this possibility, which is all under the rubric of the Internet of Things, everything.
We had, in fact, the data from, not the field experiment work that I described right now, but earlier work with the vending machines that used wirelessly enabled vending machines. That was the first wirelessly enabled network in the US. So we were kind of in on the ground level when that first started to be deployed. I think you're right. There is a big opportunity for kind of getting in on the ground level and being able to see that as it first comes to light. Yeah.
Okay. Again, I want to ask us to thank our presenters again for their excellent presentations.